The dust was not merely a coating on the land, it was the land itself, ground to a fine choking powder by an indifferent sun. It settled in the creases of Caleb's knuckles, in the lines around his eyes, and in the silence that had become his only steady companion. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the warped timbers of his cabin, on the thirsty soil of the yard, and on the vast, empty canvas of the plains that stretched out to a horizon shimmering like a fever dream. Silence out here was a living thing, a predator that stalked the edges of a man's sanity. It was made of the rhythmic creak of the porch swing he never used, the dry rustle of sagebrush, and the vast, hollow hum of a sky too big for one person to stand under. Caleb was a man carved from the same harsh material as his surroundings, all hard lines and weathered surfaces, his face a road map of every hardship the land had offered and he had endured. He stood at the edge of his property, a length of rusted wire clutched in a gloved hand, his gaze fixed on the dirt track that passed for a road. He was expecting a man, a Mr. Lee, according to the carefully penned letter that had arrived a month prior, a response to an advertisement he had placed in an Eastern paper out of sheer, bone-deep desperation. He needed a hand, someone strong enough to wrestle a calf and stubborn enough not to be broken by the loneliness. The letter had been concise, its penmanship surprisingly delicate for a man seeking such work, but the name was plain enough. Mr. Lee. Caleb pictured someone stout, perhaps a little green but willing. He could work with willing. He could not, however, work with this crippling debt and the shadow of Silas Croft, a man who collected land the way a vulture collects bones. The stagecoach appeared first as a smudge of motion against the shimmering horizon, a beetle crawling across a hot plate. It grew slowly, painfully, resolving into a familiar shape of faded red paint and churning dust. Caleb squinted, his shoulders tight with a mixture of hope and suspicion. Hope was a dangerous currency in this place, easily spent and rarely replenished. As the coach groaned to a halt, the driver, a man whose face was permanently grimaced from the sun, offered a curt nod. The door swung open with a shriek of tortured metal, and a boot descended. It was a small boot, made of dark, polished leather, utterly unsuited for the ankle-deep dust it now occupied. Following the boot was a figure so profoundly out of place that Caleb felt a dull, frustrated anger begin to smolder in his gut. It was a woman. She was small, her frame delicate beneath a modest, dark traveling dress that, while practical for a city, was an invitation to heatstroke out here. Her hair was the color of polished jet, pulled back in a severe, tight bun, and her face was a study in stillness, her dark eyes taking in the brutal landscape without a flicker of dismay. She carried a single, heavy-looking leather satchel. She was, Caleb noted with a sinking finality, of Asian descent, a fact that would make her an object of curiosity and suspicion in the nearby town, and an utter enigma out here. The driver heaved a trunk from the roof and dropped it to the ground with a thud that sent up a puff of ochre dust. "This is it," he grunted, not to Caleb, but to the unblinking sky. "End of the line." The woman stepped forward, her movements economical and precise. She looked from the bleak outline of the cabin to Caleb's unyielding form. "You are Mr. Blackwood?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, low, and carried an accent that was subtle but distinct, like the scent of a foreign spice on the wind. Caleb did not answer immediately. He let the silence stretch, a tool he often used to measure a person. He looked at her soft hands, the straightness of her spine, the sheer, impossible wrongness of her presence. "I am," he finally said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "I was expecting Mr. Lee." A flicker of something, perhaps understanding, perhaps faint amusement, crossed her features before being suppressed. "There has been a misunderstanding," she stated, not as an apology but as a fact. She held out a gloved hand, not for shaking, but to present a small calling card. "My name is Maylin Lee. The M in my correspondence stands for Maylin." Caleb stared at the card, then back at her face. The truth of the situation settled on him like a shroud. He had not hired a farmhand. He had hired an accountant. The advertisement had been vague, asking for an assistant to help manage a failing ranch, and in his haste he had assumed manage meant wrestling with fences and livestock, not with columns of damning figures. He had wasted his last dollars bringing a bookkeeper to a place that was bleeding to death. "An accountant," he said, the words flat and dead in the oppressive air. The smoldering anger flared into a cold, hard knot in his stomach. "I have no use for an accountant. I need a man who can work." "The numbers would suggest otherwise, Mr. Blackwood," she replied, her tone still perfectly level. "A ranch does not fail because the fences are weak. It fails because the finances are broken." He wanted to laugh, a harsh, barking sound. He wanted to tell her to get back on the stagecoach and disappear back into whatever world she had come from. He wanted to rage at the cruel joke fate had played on him, but the coach was already pulling away, the jangle of its harness fading into the immense silence, leaving the two of them alone under the vast, bruised purple sky. She was here, and she was a problem he did not know how to solve. "The stage does not return for a month," he said, the statement a sentence for them both. Her eyes followed the disappearing coach, and for the first time he saw a shadow of vulnerability cross her face before it was once again masked by that unshakable composure. "I am aware," she said. "I will earn my keep until then." Caleb looked at her, at the small, determined set of her jaw, at the heavy satchel that likely contained ledgers and pens instead of anything useful, and a profound weariness washed over him. He had been fighting this land, fighting his debts, fighting the ghost of his father's failures for years. Now, he had a new, entirely unexpected battle to face. He turned without another word and walked back toward the cabin, the heavy silence of the plains rushing in to fill the space between them. He did not look back to see if she was following. He knew she would be. People like her, people with that kind of quiet steel in their spines, they always followed. The cabin was a testament to his life, functional, Spartan, and devoid of any softness. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a rough-hewn table and two chairs sat in the center of the single room, and a narrow cot was pushed against the far wall. The air inside was thick with the scent of wood smoke, old leather, and solitude. Maylin stepped across the threshold and set down her satchel, her gaze sweeping over the space with an unnerving thoroughness. It was the gaze of someone assessing assets and liabilities, and Caleb felt a sudden, sharp defensiveness. This was his home, his failure, and he did not want it catalogued by this stranger. "There's a small room in the back," he said, gesturing with his chin toward a closed door. "It was a larder. It's empty now." He did not offer to help with her trunk. He did not offer her a drink of water. He offered her nothing but the barest acknowledgement of her existence, a grudging concession to the circumstances that had trapped them together. He watched her carry her heavy trunk into the small, windowless room, her movements betraying no sign of strain, and the knot of frustration in his gut tightened. The next day, the sky, which had been a merciless blue, began to curdle, turning a sickly shade of gray. The air grew heavy and still, charged with an expectant energy. A storm was coming. It was a physical manifestation of their shared predicament, an atmospheric prison reinforcing the one imposed by the stagecoach schedule. Caleb felt it in his bones, an old ache that always flared before the rain. He spent the morning securing the livestock, his movements economical and grim. He worked with a furious energy, trying to sweat out the frustration that simmered just beneath his skin. Every so often, his eyes would flick toward the cabin, where he knew she was, an unwelcome and useless presence. He had left the cabin's main room in its usual state of organized chaos. Ledgers, receipts, and threatening letters from the bank were piled on the table, a paper monument to his impending ruin. He expected her to be intimidated by it, to retreat to her small room and wait for him to solve the problem of her. When he finally returned to the cabin near midday, driven indoors by the first fat drops of rain, he was met with a sight that stopped him in his tracks. The chaos was gone. The table was clear, wiped clean. On its surface, the mountain of paper had been sorted into neat, ordered stacks, weighted down with small stones. A fire was crackling in the hearth, chasing away the sudden chill, and a pot of something that smelled faintly of dried herbs and jerky was simmering over the flames. Mei Lin sat at the table, a ledger open before her, a sharpened pencil moving with swift, silent precision down a column of figures. She did not look up when he entered. He stood there for a long moment, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, his mind struggling to process the scene. The sheer, quiet competence of it was more jarring than any argument or plea would have been. He had expected helplessness. He had been met with industry. Later that afternoon, a section of fence on the north pasture gave way. A loud crack, carried on the wind, announced the failure. It was an old post, rotted at the base, and the wind-driven rain had been the final insult. Half a dozen steers, spooked by the storm, were now in danger of wandering onto Croft's land, a mistake that would give the man a legal pretext to seize them. Cursing, Caleb pulled on his slicker and grabbed his tools. It was a man's job, a hard, muddy, thankless task that he would have to do alone in the driving rain. "I'll be back before dark," he grunted, the words a dismissal. He didn't want her help. He couldn't even imagine what form it would take. He returned hours later, soaked to the bone, muscles aching, his hands raw and bleeding from wrestling with the wire and the new post. The rain had settled into a miserable, steady drizzle. He was exhausted, angry, and braced for the same quiet, judgmental order he had left behind. But the cabin was different again. The simmering pot now smelled rich and savory, and on the table, next to the neatly stacked papers, lay a single, yellowed document held down by a rock. Mei Lin was not at the table. She was standing by the hearth, her back to him, stirring the pot. She seemed to sense his presence and turned. Her expression was, as always, unreadable. She simply nodded toward the table. "You should look at that," she said. He approached the table with suspicion, his tired mind wary of another complication. He picked up the document. It was old, the ink faded. It was the original deed to his property, filed by his grandfather. He had seen it 100 times, a useless piece of history. But as he looked closer, he saw that she had used her pencil to lightly circle a passage in the dense legal script. It was a clause he had never noticed, a water rights addendum tied to an old territorial treaty that predated the founding of the county itself. It granted his property irrevocable and primary access to the waters of the Red Creek, the very creek that Silas Croft claimed as his own. Caleb read the passage twice, then a third time. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was as clear as a spring morning. His grandfather, a man he had only known through his father's bitter stories, had secured a right that no one, not even a man as powerful as Croft, could legally take away. It was not a solution to all his problems, but it was a weapon, a powerful one. He had been sitting on it for years, buried under a mountain of debt and despair, and had never even known it. He looked up from the deed, his eyes finding Maylene across the room. She had turned back to the fire, given him space. She had not fixed his fence. She had not rounded up his cattle. She had done something far more important. In a few hours of quiet, methodical work, she had unearthed a foundation he thought had long since crumbled to dust. He said nothing. He simply folded the deed carefully and placed it in the inner pocket of his coat. He walked over to the wash basin and began to scrub the mud and blood from his hands. A fragile truce settled over the small cabin, as quiet and momentous as the cessation of a long storm. He still did not know what to make of this woman, this accountant who had appeared out of nowhere. But for the first time since she had stepped off that stagecoach, he began to suspect that she was not a liability. She might just be an asset. He began to watch her, not with frustration, but with a cautious, burgeoning respect. He watched the way she moved, the efficiency in her small gestures, the way she could make a meal from almost nothing, the way her mind worked behind those still, dark eyes. His world had been a place of solitude and brute force. She had introduced a new element, intellect, and Caleb Blackwood, for all his stoicism, was smart enough to recognize a paradigm shift when he saw one. The truce in the cabin was a delicate thing, woven from shared silence and the unspoken acknowledgement of mutual competence. Caleb worked the land with a renewed, if grim, determination, the knowledge of the old deed a hard kernel of hope in his chest. Maylene, in turn, transformed the chaotic table into a command center. She worked through his finances with a relentless, surgical precision, her pencil a scalpel cutting away years of neglect and despair. She did not offer opinions or judgments. She simply presented facts, laid out in stark, clear columns of black and red. The red was a river of debt, deep and wide, but for the first time Caleb could see its banks. He could see its source. Their days fell into a rhythm. He would rise before dawn, the scent of coffee already filling the small cabin. She would be at the table, a single lamp illuminating her work. He would nod, she would nod back, and he would head out into the vast, lonely expanse of his land. When he returned at dusk, weary and caked in the dust of his labor, a simple, hot meal would be waiting. They ate in silence, but it was no longer the hostile silence of strangers. It was the comfortable silence of two people working toward a common, desperate goal: survival. He learned to appreciate the quiet order she brought to his life. She learned the geography of his exhaustion, the subtle shift in his posture that spoke of a good day or a bad one. The external world intruded upon their fragile peace a week later. It arrived in the form of a gleaming black buggy pulled by two perfectly matched geldings, an obscene display of wealth against the muted tones of the prairie. At the reins was Silas Croft, a man whose physical softness was belied by the predatory stillness in his eyes. He was flanked by two hired men, their hands resting casually on the pistols at their hips, their expressions uniformly sullen. Caleb was splitting wood when they arrived, the rhythmic thud of the axe a counterpoint to the quiet hum of the afternoon. He saw the buggy approach and slowly, deliberately set the axe down, resting its head against the chopping block. He wiped his hands on his trousers and waited, a solid, unmovable object in the path of the encroaching threat. Croft pulled the buggy to a halt and surveyed the modest ranch with a look of theatrical disdain. His gaze swept over the repaired fence, the neatly stacked woodpile, and the thin curl of smoke rising from the cabin's chimney. It was the look of a man assessing property, not a home. "Black wood," Croft said, his voice smooth and oiled, a stark contrast to the grit of the landscape. "Still trying to squeeze water from this stone, are we?" "It's my stone, Croft," Caleb replied, his voice low and even. Croft chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "For now. I've been looking over your accounts, been buying up your paper from the bank. You're in deep, deeper than you know." He let the threat hang in the air, a palpable thing. "I'm prepared to make you an offer. A final one, enough to get you out from under, let you start somewhere new, a gesture of neighborly goodwill." The cabin door opened. Mei Lin stepped out onto the porch, her hands clasped behind her back. She did not look at Croft or his men. Her eyes were fixed on the far horizon, her expression a mask of serene indifference. Croft's eyes narrowed, taking in her foreign features, her immaculate, if simple dress. A smirk twisted his lips. "Well, well. Found yourself some company, Blackwood. I didn't take you for the type, though I suppose even a pauper needs his comforts." He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust near the porch steps, a calculated act of disrespect. The insult was aimed as much at Caleb as it was at her, a way of marking his territory, of demonstrating his power. Caleb's hands clenched into fists at his sides. A cold, dangerous anger coiled in his belly. He took a half-step forward, his entire body tensing for violence. But it was Mei Lin who reacted first, though her reaction was nearly imperceptible. Her jaw tightened. A flicker of something old and painful flashed in her dark eyes before being ruthlessly suppressed. The words of another man, a man from her past, echoed in her memory. "You are worth nothing." A pretty distraction, a silent ornament. Croft's casual cruelty was a familiar poison. Yet she did not flinch. She did not retreat into the cabin. She held her ground, her stillness a form of defiance more powerful than any shouted retort. Her gaze finally shifted from the horizon and met Croft's. It was a cold, analytical look, the look of an entomologist studying an unpleasant insect. Croft, accustomed to fear or fury, seemed momentarily thrown by her absolute composure. He turned his attention back to Caleb. "Think about my offer, Blackwood. It's more than this place is worth. It expires in 1 week. After that, I'll just take it." He snapped the reins, and the buggy turned in a wide, arrogant circle, churning up the dust of Caleb's yard. As they rode away, one of the hired guns looked back and laughed, a mean, ugly sound that scraped against the silence. Caleb stood frozen for a long moment after they were gone, the rage still singing in his veins. He looked over at Mei Lin on the porch. The mask was still in place, but he could see the faint tremor in her clasped hands, the rigid set of her shoulders. He had seen her as an accountant, a quiet force of order. Now, for the first time, he saw her as a woman who had been wounded before, a woman who had learned to build walls of silence and stillness to protect herself. A fierce, unfamiliar protective instinct surged within him. Croft had not just threatened his land, he had trespassed on something more personal. "He can't have it," Caleb said, the words of vow spoken to the dust. Mei Lin finally lowered her hands. "No," she said, her voice quiet but resonant with the cold fury of her own. "He cannot." She turned and went back inside the cabin, leaving Caleb alone with the fading dust of Croft's buggy and the hardening resolve in his own heart. The threat was no longer a column of figures in a ledger. It was here, on his land, and it had a face. The week that followed Croft's visit was heavy with a silent, simmering tension. Every sunrise felt like a countdown. Caleb worked himself to the point of exhaustion, reinforcing fences, checking his rifle, preparing for a physical confrontation he knew was inevitable. He was a man of action, and Croft's threat demanded a physical response. Mei Lin, however, retreated deeper into her world of numbers and letters. She spent hours poring over the old deed, cross-referencing it with territorial maps she had found in an old almanac. She was preparing for a different kind of war, one fought with ink and law instead of lead and steel. The crisis arrived not with the thunder of hooves, but with the silence of a dying creek. 3 days before Croft's deadline, Caleb went to the Red Creek for water and found it reduced to a muddy trickle. The lifeblood of his ranch was gone. He followed the creek bed upstream for a mile, his boots sinking into the damp, exposed earth. The dread in his stomach grew with every step. At the edge of his property line, he found the cause. A fresh, hastily constructed dam of earth and timber blocked the flow, diverting the water onto Croft's sprawling lands. It was a declaration of war, a siege. Without water, his cattle would die, his land would turn to desert, and he would be broken within days. He returned to the cabin, his face a thunderous mask of fury. His mind was already racing, calculating the amount of dynamite it would take to blow the dam to splinters. He burst through the door, his movements jerky with rage. He damned the creek. Mei Lin looked up from the table, her expression calm. I expected he would. Her placid response infuriated him. Expected? He's strangling us. I'm going to ride into town, get some blasting powder. I'll tear it down tonight. His plan was simple, direct, an act of brute force against brute force. No, she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through his anger. It was the first time she had used such a tone with him. She stood up and walked over to him, placing a hand on his arm. Her touch was light, but it held a surprising strength, an anchor in the storm of his rage. That is what he wants you to do. He wants you to respond with violence. It would give him the legal right to have you arrested for destroying his property. The dam is on his land, even if it violates your rights. He has the corrupt sheriff in his pocket. You would be in a cell before morning, and he would have the ranch. Her logic was a bucket of cold water, dousing the flames of his immediate fury. He knew she was right, his fists unclenched. Then what do? We can't just sit here and watch everything die. We do not, she said, her eyes burning with an intensity he had never seen before. This was not the quiet accountant. This was someone else entirely, a tactician revealing her strategy. We fight him, but we fight him on our terms in our arena. She led him to the table, which was now covered not just with ledgers but with maps. She had used charcoal to draw lines, to mark points, to chart out a campaign. Here, she said, her finger tapping the old deed. This is our canon. It is old, powerful, and its authority is absolute. And here, she tapped another document, a faded tax record from the county assessor's office, is the ammunition. I have spent the last week analyzing every land purchase Silas Croft has made in this territory for the past 10 years. He did not buy land. He acquired it through predatory loans, using the bank he controls to foreclose on ranchers during drought years. But his water rights claims for all those properties are based on a newer, weaker county charter. Our deed predates that charter. His entire empire is a house of cards built on a faulty legal foundation. Caleb stared at her, at the intricate web of evidence she had woven from the dusty, forgotten papers of his own history. He had seen only failure in those documents. She had seen a weapon. His strength was in his arms, in his knowledge of the land. Hers was in this ability to see the patterns hidden beneath the surface, to wield logic like a blade. "His dam is illegal," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "But we cannot simply tear it down. We must have his actions officially condemned. We will go to the land registrar's office in town. We will file a formal injunction, citing the territorial treaty in this deed. It will force a legal confrontation. The registrar is in Croft's pocket, just like the sheriff," Caleb countered, the familiar cynicism returning. "Probably," she conceded. "But the registrar's office is a place of public record. The law, even when corruptly administered, has procedures. Croft thrives in the shadows, using threats and backroom deals. We will force him into the light. You will be my protection, my show of force that ensures we are heard. Your reputation is that of a man who does not seek trouble, but who will not back down. We will use that. Your presence will be the threat of violence that prevents actual violence. And she paused, taking a deep breath, I will be the one who dismantles his argument, piece by piece, in front of witnesses." He looked from her determined face to the map on the table. It was a bold, dangerous plan. It required him to put his faith not in his own strength, but in hers. It meant trusting her mind over his muscle. The transactional arrangement they had fallen into, the grudging respect he had developed for her, was now solidifying into something more. This was a partnership, forged in the crucible of this crisis. They were no longer just a rancher and his accountant. They were two sides of the same coin, two halves of a single strategy for survival. "When do we leave?" he asked. "At dawn," she replied without hesitation. "And Mr. Blackwood?" "Caleb," he corrected her, the name feeling strange and new on his own tongue. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. "Caleb," she repeated, "bring your rifle, but do not use it unless I tell you to." The ride to town was a silent, tense affair. The sun beat down on them, baking the already thirsty land. Caleb rode his sturdiest horse, his rifle resting in a scabbard by his knee. Maylene sat astride a gentler mare, her posture as straight and unyielding as a soldier's. She carried her leather satchel, its contents now more valuable than gold. They were a strange pair. The big, weathered frontiersman and the small, composed woman in a dark dress riding together into a confrontation that would determine both their futures. The town of Redemption was a single dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings, a place that had long ago traded its soul for pragmatism. As they rode down the main street, curtains twitched in windows. Faces appeared in doorways. The community, the Greek chorus to their drama, watched them pass, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, pity, and suspicion. Caleb Blackwood, the stubborn recluse, and the strange foreign woman who lived with him. Their arrival was an event. The land registrar's office was at the end of the street, next to the sheriff's. As they dismounted, Caleb saw one of Croft's men lounging on the boardwalk opposite. The man saw them, straightened up, and casually sauntered into the saloon. The warning had been sent. They would not have long. Inside, the office was dim and smelled of stale paper and chewing tobacco. A balding, nervous-looking clerk sat behind a high counter. Behind him, at a large desk, sat the registrar himself, a man named Peters with a florid face and shifty eyes. Sheriff Brody, a weary man whose badge seemed to weigh him down, leaned against a filing cabinet, a silent observer. Blackwood, The sheriff grunted, his tone neutral. "What's your business?" Before Caleb could answer, Maylene stepped forward, placing her satchel on the counter with a soft thud. "We're here to file an injunction against Silas Croft for the illegal obstruction of a waterway," she announced, her voice clear and steady, filling the quiet room. The clerk blinked. "Registrar." Peters sputtered, his face turning a shade redder. "Injunction? On what grounds? Croft owns the land the dam is on." "He may own the land," Maylin replied, "but he does not own the water. The rights to the Red Creek are dictated by the Territorial Treaty of 1848, which grants primary and inalienable access to the property currently owned by Mr. Caleb Blackwood." She slid the original deed across the counter. "As you can see in Article 4, Section 2. Peters stared at the document as if it were a coiled snake. He licked his lips nervously. At that moment, the door swung open and Silas Croft strode in, flanked by the two men who had been at the ranch. His face was a mask of cold fury. "What is the meaning of this, Peters?" Croft demanded, his voice a low growl. He ignored Maylin completely, directing his power at the men he controlled. They're filing a claim, Mr. Croft," Peters stammered. "Something about an old treaty." Croft laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "An old, irrelevant piece of paper. This county operates under its own charter. My rights are secure." He turned his venomous gaze on Maylene. "And you, the little bookkeeper. You think your numbers and words matter out here? This is a world of men, little girl, a world of strength." He took a step toward her. Instantly, Caleb moved, placing himself between them. He did not draw his weapon. He did not speak. He simply stood there, a mountain of quiet, deadly intent. His presence shifted the atmosphere in the room, charging it with the promise of violence. Croft's hired men tensed, their hands dropping to their pistols. "This is not a world of strength, Mr. Croft," Maylin said, her voice cutting through the tension. She began to pull papers from her satchel, laying them out on the counter with methodical precision. "It is a world of laws. You have simply mistaken them for suggestions." She began to speak, her voice never rising, yet it commanded the attention of everyone in the room. She laid out her case with irrefutable logic. She presented the tax records, showing the pattern of Croft's predatory acquisitions. She produced the county charter he cited, and then, with devastating effect, a letter from the territorial governor's office confirming that all prior treaties, especially those concerning water rights, superseded any local charters. She had written to the Capitol weeks ago, anticipating this very confrontation. "Your claim to the Red Creek is fraudulent, Mr. Croft," she concluded, her voice ringing with the clarity of truth. "Every foreclosure you executed based on drought conditions you exacerbated by illegally diverting water is also fraudulent. Your entire empire is built on theft." The room was dead silent. The great unmasking was complete. She had not just defended Caleb's ranch, she had exposed the rotten foundation of Croft's power. Croft's face contorted in a mask of pure rage. The pretense of civility vanished. "Words!" he snarled. He lunged, not at Caleb, but at Maylin, his hand reaching to sweep the papers from the counter, to destroy the evidence of his ruin. It was the last mistake he would make. Caleb moved with a speed that was shocking in a man his size. He intercepted Croft's lunge, his hand clamping around Croft's wrist like a manacle. With a single, fluid motion, he spun the larger man around and slammed him against the counter. In the same instant, Croft's two men went for their guns. But Caleb had anticipated them. Before their pistols could clear their holsters, The barrel of Caleb's rifle was leveled at them, his thumb cocking the hammer with a sound that was as loud as a gunshot in the silent room. "Don't," Caleb said, his voice a low whisper of death. The two men froze, their eyes wide. They were hired muscle, not fanatics. They were paid to intimidate, not to die. It was then that Sheriff Brody finally moved. He had been watching, his weary face unreadable. But Maylene's evidence, combined with Croft's violent outburst and Caleb's controlled, defensive response, had finally tipped the scales. He drew his own pistol, its barrel not aimed at Caleb, but at Croft's men. "He's right," the sheriff said, his voice heavy with resignation. "Don't." He looked at Croft, pinned and helpless under Caleb's grip. "Silas, you're under arrest for assault, and from the looks of these documents, for a whole lot more." Croft sagged, defeated. The power that had defined him evaporated in an instant, leaving only a bitter, sputtering rage. The fight was over. It had been won not with the blast of dynamite, but with the quiet power of a well-argued case backed by the undeniable threat of force. In the chaos of Croft and his men being disarmed, a stray piece of broken glass from a shattered inkwell had sliced across the back of Caleb's hand, the one not holding Croft. It was a shallow, clean cut, but it bled freely, dripping dark spots onto the dusty floorboards. He barely noticed it until they were outside again, standing in the harsh sunlight of the street. Maylin looked at his hand, her composure finally cracking to reveal a flicker of concern. "You are hurt." "It's nothing," he said, but she was already taking a clean handkerchief from her dress pocket. She took his large, calloused hand in her small ones and began to wrap the wound with a gentle, practiced efficiency. They stood there for a moment in the middle of the street, the town watching them, the world seeming to hold its breath. The immediate, violent aftermath had given way to a quiet moment of care. He looked down at her dark hair, at the intense focus on her face as she tended to his minor injury. He saw not just the brilliant tactician who had saved his home, but the resilient woman who had faced down a tyrant with nothing but courage and intellect. He saw his partner. "You were right," he said, the words feeling inadequate but necessary. "Your way was better." She finished tying the knot and looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. "Our way," she corrected him softly. "It was our way." 3 months passed. The autumn sun was gentler, casting long, golden shadows across the plains. The Red Creek flowed freely, a silver ribbon of life through Caleb's land. The cattle were healthy. The small patch of land near the cabin was tilled and ready for a winter garden, and the shadow of Silas Croft was gone, replaced by the quiet, steady work of rebuilding. The town, having witnessed Croft's downfall and the quiet dignity of the pair who had caused it, had shifted its opinion. Suspicion had been replaced by a grudging, then a genuine respect. Nods on the street replaced stares. The cabin was no longer just a shelter, it was a home. A small pot of herbs grew on the windowsill. A colorful, woven blanket covered the back of one of the chairs. These small, soft touches were Maylin's, added so gradually that Caleb barely noticed them until he realized he could no longer imagine the space without them. The silence remained, but it was a shared silence, rich with understanding, no longer a predator but a comfort. They were building a low stone wall around the garden plot, a symbolic act of permanence, of laying down roots. Caleb would lift the heavy stones into place, his muscles straining. Maylin, with her eye for precision, would direct him, ensuring the fit was perfect, using smaller stones to fill the gaps, making the wall solid and strong. Their hands would sometimes brush as they worked, a fleeting contact that sent a jolt of warmth through the cool autumn air. They worked in their usual rhythm, a silent ballet of collaborative effort. Caleb set a particularly large, flat stone atop a section of the wall. He straightened up, wiping a sheen of sweat from his brow with the back of his forearm. He looked out across his land. His land, truly his now, secure and full of promise. He knew the stagecoach was due in town tomorrow. The thought, which once would have been a relief, now settled in his chest like a cold stone. A month had become 3. Her part of the bargain was more than fulfilled. She was free to go, to return to the world of cities and civilization, a world where her talents would be properly rewarded. She must have sensed the shift in his mood. She stopped fitting a small piece of shale into a crevice and looked up at him, her expression questioning. He cleared his throat, his gaze dropping to the ledger she had left on the porch steps that morning. It was open, the pages filled with her neat, precise script. The columns of black ink were growing, the river of red ink shrinking to a manageable stream. For the first time in a decade, the ranch was turning a profit. He did not ask her to stay. He did not speak of feelings or futures, for such words were foreign to his tongue. Instead, he looked from the ledger back to her, a man stating a simple, undeniable fact. "The books," he said, his voice a low rumble. "They'll need balancing for the spring season." It was not a question. It was a statement of continuity. It was an assumption that she would be here, that her work was not done, that her place was here. It was the most profound declaration he was capable of making, an offer of a shared future disguised as a practical necessity. Maylene held his gaze for a long, breathless moment. The wind whispered through the dry grass, the only sound between them. A slow, genuine smile spread across her face, a rare and beautiful thing that seemed to light her from within. It was the first time he had truly seen her smile. Her past husband had told her she was worth nothing. This quiet, stoic man was telling her, in his own way, that she was worth everything. She was the foundation upon which this new future would be built. She turned her attention back to the wall, picking up another stone. She tested its weight in her hand, then looked at the section they were building. "The west wall needs another row," she said, her voice soft but firm. "To be strong enough for winter." It was her answer. It was her acceptance. It was her own understated commitment, a promise to keep building together. Caleb watched her place the stone, her small, capable hands making their home stronger, more permanent. He reached down, picked up another rock, and laid it beside hers. The work continued, no longer a chore, but a quiet celebration of a home and a partnership, built stone by stone under the vast, hopeful sky.